The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
A man named John was sent from God. He came for testimony, to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he come to testify to the light. And this is the testimony of John. When the Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to him to ask him, "Who are you?" he admitted, and did not deny it, but admitted, "I am not the Christ." So they asked him, "What are you then? Are you Elijah?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you, so we can give answer to those who sent us? And what do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the desert, 'Make straight the way of the Lord.' As Isaiah the prophet said." Some Pharisees were also sent, and they asked him, "Why then do you baptize, if you are not the Christ, or Elijah, or the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water, but there is one among you who you do not recognize, the one who is coming after me, whose sandal straps I am not worthy to untie." This happened in Bethany, across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
My brothers and sisters in Christ, today is Gaudete Sunday, which is what we used to call it. Now it's just the third Sunday of Advent. But the priest still has the option of wearing a pink vestment if he so wishes. And you notice, of course, in the third Sunday of Advent, we have a pink candle, or to call it more correctly, rose-colored candle, or rose-colored vestment. But I'm reminded of a story of a priest friend of mine when I was first ordained, and I celebrated Mass with him and the third Sunday of Advent. And he had on this rose-colored vestment. And so just before he begins his homily, he reminds the people that it's a Sunday of time for joy and so on and so on. And Gaudete literally means to rejoice, as our second reading here reminds us today, to rejoice. But he made it very clear to the congregation. And this was a huge church, and I mean huge. You're talking about maybe, at the lower estimate, 7,500 families. Huge church. And he reminds the people in a jam-packed church that he does not want anybody calling his vestments pink, because that would be wrong. It's rose-colored. And he went on with the Mass. He went on with his homily in the Mass and so on and so on. And he and I are walking out, and everybody's flooding out. We're going around the backside. We're coming around the side of the building where there's people just flooding out of the church, and I'm walking next to him. And I hear these little pitter-patter of feet. And I stopped for a moment. He must have heard it too, because he stopped. And we both turned around, and here's this little girl, 5 or 6 years old. And you know somebody put her up to this. Of that I have no doubt. Never did catch the culprit. But she pulls on Father's vestment. She said, "Father, that's a nice pink dress you got on." You should have seen his face. It was pinker than the vestment he had on. So I don't care if you call it pink or rose. It doesn't matter. You know, it's whatever color. Rose is basically what it would be called. You can call it pink. It really doesn't matter. But it's just something that I remember, because today we celebrate Gaudete Sunday, a time to rejoice. And we've been talking in this season a little bit about, the Advent season being a penitential season. The first Sunday of Advent, I talked about how it was celebrated throughout the Middle Ages. It was a penitential time. It was a time for penance. It was a time for fasting. It was a time for prayer. It's completely been turned upside down for us. It's no longer a time for prayer and penance and reflecting and so on and so on. It's now a season about shopping and partying, going to Christmas parties, getting drunk, drinking a spiked punch, office parties, people's parties, house parties, you name it, whatever. And Christmas shopping. So by the time Christmas rolls around, the birth of Christ, which certainly for us is a time of joy, it should be, because without it we have no redemption, we have no salvation, we have no opportunity to get into heaven at all without Christ coming into the world. So by the time Christmas rolls around, not only do we not have anything to offer to Christ, nothing, zero, but all we can say is, I'm glad it's over. And then I got to figure out what gifts I got to take back to the store. And I don't want to complain about the things I didn't get, and so on. But that's modern man. It's the way he looks at things. But it's always been an understanding that Christmas, Christ's Mass, that's where the word comes from, is about Christ. That I have a gift or something prepared for him that I can present to him on his birthday. How many of us in the last 3 weeks, or in this last week coming up, are preparing a gift for the Christ child when he comes into the world? Like maybe we decided to forgive someone whom we haven't forgiven in 40 years. Maybe we decided to let go of something we haven't been able to let go of for 60 years, or 10 years, or 5 years, or whatever. Maybe we're holding a grudge against someone. Maybe someone has done us wrong. But how about offering that as a gift, letting go? And the season of Advent is supposed to be precisely about that. To offer penances, to look at oneself, to take the time to look at oneself. In what way can I become better? Fasting and prayer is the way Christmas was, the Advent season was celebrated. It was a miniature Lent, and the people took it seriously. And the third Sunday of Advent was a time to catch your breath for a moment, because you have been fasting, you've been doing penances, you've been offering your prayers, you've been preparing yourself for the midnight mass. And remember, if you look at the history of the church throughout the Middle Ages especially, the only mass that you will find is the midnight mass. There's no other mass. It wasn't until after the Second Vatican Council we started adding masses. We got the children's mass, we got the choir's mass, we got this mass, we got that, we got the evening mass, we got that mass, and we got another mass, and so on and so on. And basically what it comes to just piles up to a bunch of masses. And tradition tells us that Christ was born exactly at midnight. That if he was born in Bethlehem, all time stopped. In the entire world, time stopped for a moment. God can do that, by the way. And every tree and every flower blossomed in an instant, all around the world. So midnight mass was always the mass that was celebrated throughout the ages. There weren't 7 p.m. masses, or 9, or 11, or 10, or whatever. It was 12. And then you went home and you celebrated the day belonging to God, and you could go home and do whatever, celebrate with the family, whatever traditions a particular community or family had, and so on and so on. And like I said before, there really wasn't an exchange of gifts like it is today. We give each other gifts, when in reality it isn't even our birthday, unless it is your birthday, but it isn't our birthday. It's the birthday of Christ. Like I said, we usually have nothing we can offer him. The custom, like I said, and I've explained before, was basically to give things to the poor. You know, if there were poor families in the community, you knew they were short of food, had a lot of kids, and didn't have enough food always to go around. The community prepared things for that family to give food to them, to make sure they had enough. If you had homeless people, you made sure that they had new clothes, clean clothes, they could be warm, or you would even invite them into your home for a meal, and so on and so on. That was the exchange of gifts. That was a celebration of Christmas. Now, in commercialism, in the last couple of 100 years, we've taken on a completely different dimension. It's all about Christmas presents. Kids will tell you ahead of time what they want for Christmas. And parents will ask their kids, what do you want for Christmas? And if they don't get it, they'll throw a tantrum. And we forget to remind our children that Christmas is about Christ. What can you give to Christ for Christmas? And you certainly don't need to give him a plastic doll of his mother, I can tell you that. He has the real deal. We need to prepare our hearts to give something to Christ so we don't come empty-handed. And I told you, I think the first Sunday of Advent, there used to be a custom that they put the manger scene up. Even if they didn't put up the first week, they put the crib. They put the crib up, and they left it empty. And they had a bucket of hay that would be next to the crib. And the parishioners, when they were coming to Mass on the Sundays of Advent, would come forward as they came into church, and if they had done a certain amount of good things during the week, let's say maybe they helped somebody, maybe they held back from saying something that they wanted to say, but it wasn't good, it wasn't positive, they didn't say it, so it was considered a good thing, a good deed. And the idea was that you came into church, let's say you did 5 good things, you placed 5 pieces of straw into the crib. And you do that for 4 weeks of Advent. By the time Christmas comes around, and the Christ child is carried in at midnight, the crib is full of hay. As on his very first day that he was born, he was placed on hay. The crib is now full of all the good deeds of all the people of the parish. And the Christ child is placed upon the hay. But today everything sort of kind of is plastic, it's laid out and pre-prepared and so on and so on. There isn't any connection anymore to the reality of the mystery of Christ himself. Yeah, we go to Mass because it's an obligation. But we really don't understand, what are we celebrating? Yeah, we're celebrating the birth of Christ. You know, for many Christians, it's about an event that took place 2,000 years ago. I wasn't there, so it doesn't matter much to me. But Christmas is a celebration for us and should always be a celebration for us, because every Mass is a miniature Christmas, because it's Christ's Mass. Every Mass. We receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of the living God. He comes to dwell within us. My Father and I will come to make our home within you. As St. Paul says, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That unique mystery we have celebrated for 2,000 years, and we're reminded at Christmas time that Christ comes to us. That we receive him within our being in actuality and in substance. It's not a memory of 2,000 years ago, it's an actual reality in the here and now. That's Christmas. What I find very difficult to understand, Christmas time, modern psychology tells us, is the saddest time of year for many people. It's when the most suicides are committed in the Western world. Why? You got all the commercialism in the world. You You can buy yourself whatever you want, whenever you want it. But everybody knows that material things don't make people happy. Look who the unhappiest human beings on the face of the earth are billionaires and millionaires. They got everything. The suicide rate is the highest among them than it is upon people who have nothing. It's sad, but you know what? Christmas isn't about all this materialism. It's about Christ. And somewhere along the way, we need to get back to that mystery. We need to get back to that understanding that we don't sing happy birthday with a cake with 2,000 candles on it. We look forward to Christ coming into our being in a new way, unique way, as he comes to us at every Mass. Body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, Christ's Mass at every Mass. Christ comes into our being. That has been always the teachings of the church from the very, very beginning, from the time of the apostles. We don't simply have to look back in the past. We can experience Christ in the here and now. That's the beauty of our Catholic faith. Maybe we'll take a little bit more time at Christmas to talk about all of that. Last week I talked about the only person to ever be pre-announced. For 4,000 years, the prophets had foretold the coming of the Messiah, not just the Jewish people. But I read to you accounts where traditions, even in a Gentile history, had foretold the coming of the Messiah, even during the time of the Greek philosophers. They had some conceptual notion and understanding that one day someone will come who will remove the curse of humanity, the curse of sin, the original sin, the tendency towards sin, the tendency to love sin, and to try to find our happiness in it. And I went through some of the different accounts of some of the different histories of the Gentiles, the Greeks, the Romans. Also were expecting a Messiah, somebody to come. The Mohammedans, the Muslims, also are expecting a Messiah to come to take away the sins of humanity. So it wasn't just the Jews. Christ was told, it was foretold that he was going to come. And like I said last week, there is no other human being that has ever lived on the face of the earth. No other human being outside of the Virgin herself. But no other religious founder had ever been foretold. Nowhere will you ever find a preparation for the coming of Muhammad. Nowhere. The name of his mother and his birthplace isn't even recorded anywhere. We don't even know. Buddha. No one had foretold his coming. Confucius, nobody had foretold his coming. But Christ's coming was clearly foretold for 4,000 years. And I told you a story about a very famous, and I guess what we would call, at least he was called the smartest rabbi in the time of Christ. He was well known and well respected, and St. Paul sat at his feet to study to become a rabbi for 29 years. And it was in that last year, because you had to study for 30 years before you became a rabbi, it was in that last year that he was knocked off of his horse and ran into Christ and became a Christian. But this rabbi, Gamaliel, began to search through traditions and the history of the Jewish people, the foretelling of the coming of the Messiah. And he began to look at Christ. And he began to look at the prophecies of the Old Testament. And he began to realize that all the prophecies in the Old Testament that had foretold all the different things about Christ, where he would be born, where he would die, where he would live, and so on and so on. All of it was completed and fulfilled in Christ. It took him 30 years. But 30 years later, he's baptized into the Catholic Church, and he dies a Catholic Christian. Only some years later. Christ is the true Messiah. He is the one that has been foretold. He is the one that was expected. Christmas for us should be a time of joy and celebration, certainly. And don't think for a moment that, Father's a Scrooge and I'm against giving gifts and all of that. That's not the point. The history of giving gifts doesn't even come out of the Magi. Many people think, well, it was the Magi. I've asked people, I said, where do you think the idea of giving Christmas gifts come from? Oh, it's the Magi who brought the gifts to Christ. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. The tradition has it that it comes into existence because of the Feast of St. Nicholas, December 6th. When we celebrate St. Nicholas, a very, very generous bishop who had a family in his parish. The father wanted to get his daughters married, but he had no dowry, he had no money to get them married. So he was going to sell them into prostitution so he could raise the money to get them married. St. Nicholas heard of it. And so he would go, as the girls became of age, he would go and drop these gold bags into the window, the open window at night. Of course, the word got out and people found out who was doing this and things, and he began to help other people and so on and so on. He gave things away, and the idea, of course, of giving things and giving gifts is rooted in St. Nicholas. Not the fat guy at the North Pole either, by the way. St. Nicholas is an actual saint of the church. He's not a fat guy. He was a bishop who fasted a lot and prayed a lot. I could tell you, but we don't have the time. I could tell you the story how the Nicholas at the North Pole even came about, but we'll just leave that for now because we have children here, so we'll leave it at that. But just a little reminder today that Christ was foretold. We're expecting him. He has come. He comes to us at Mass. Every Mass we go to is a time of anticipation, a time when we receive him, a time of desire, a time when we are closer to him, a time when he comes into our being to reveal himself to us and be born in us, that he may once again live within man. It's been the entire expression of Catholicism for 2,000 years, and it doesn't matter how many times one reads the Bible. One cannot receive Christ by reading pages. One must receive the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ.